Your stepfather drained my checking account. Maya, he took every dollar, all $14,200. That was the first thing my mother said when I walked into her kitchen in Round Rock on March 2nd, 2024 at 7:14 in the evening. No hello, just her voice breaking and her phone shaking in her hand with the banking app open and the balance line showing 0. I had watched her build that cushion one grocery shift at a time after my father died. Now it was gone in one transfer. I did not have to ask who. Rick was already there, leaning against the refrigerator like he owned the place beer can in his hand eyes on me. And guess what, sweetheart, he said? Your savings are next. Family money stays in the family. The way he said family sounded more like a threat than a promise. Tyler wandered in from the hallway in a tank top and shorts, chewing gum, looking pleased with himself. Big saver girl needs to share, he said. That $280,000 is better off in my recovery fund. The room seemed to narrow around that number. I had never spoken it out loud to anyone in this house. 8 years at Safewave Promotions overtime, saying no to vacations and new cars, all so I could put away enough to feel safe for once. My mom knew I had a savings account, but not the exact amount. Hearing Tyler say it made my skin prickle. How do you know that? I asked. My voice sounded thin and far away. Rick pushed off the fridge and walked closer, holding a printed page between 2 fingers, like a trophy. Because I actually look out for this family, he said. Unlike some people. He slapped the printout on the counter. It was my mother's account history. Deposit after deposit, and then one final move, all $14,200, into an account labeled household that I knew was his. Tomorrow at 9 in the morning, he said calmly, you are going to unlock your savings and link them to the same structure. Or you can pack your things and leave my house. The way he said my house made my jaw clench. My father bought this place. Rick brought in a pickup truck and a bad attitude and decided the deed came with his name on it. My mother stared at the floor. Maya, please, she whispered. Just do what he says. I do not want any more problems. Problems. Not theft, not betrayal, just problems. I felt something inside me go very still. I looked at her, then at him. All right, I said. It came out soft, almost bored. Tyler laughed. See, he said. Told you. She will fold. I walked past them down the hallway to my old room. I closed the door gently. No slam doors, no yelling. That part of the story was over. My laptop was still on my desk where I had left it before my shift. When I opened it, the Safewave internal console filled the screen. A new alert flashed at the top. High-severity unauthorized login attempt detected on external savings account associated with employee profile. Source internet protocol matches registered home address. Timestamp 6:37 p.m. While my mother was standing in that kitchen watching her balance drop to 0, they had already tried to break into my account. It should have shocked me. It did not. People rarely stop at one line once they decide they are entitled to your life. I picked up my phone and scrolled to a contact saved under one word, Anchor. She answered on the second ring. Maya, she said, I told you this day would come. They went after my savings, I said. Mom's account is already empty. There was a short silence, not surprised, just tired. Open the folder I sent you last month, she said. The one labeled Risk 72. Back everything up tonight. Do not confront him alone again. I opened my cloud drive. At the top sat a folder I had been pretending not to see. Risk 72 Evidence Pack Rick Hale. Inside were subfolders by month, audio templates, a list of attorneys in Travis County, even a half-completed petition with my name already typed in. If anyone has ever tried to take what you worked years for, tell me your city and your state in the comments. I read every single one. I selected the whole folder and hit download. In the living room, I could hear the television and Rick laughing at something. The sound rolling down the hallway like nothing at all was wrong. On my screen, the progress bar moved from left to right. When it finished, I renamed the master folder with a single word, Exit. Then I sat back in my chair and listened to the hum of the fridge, the canned laughter, the faint clink of a bottle on the counter, and under all of it, the steady beat of my own heart, finally sounding less like fear and more like a countdown. Rick thought tomorrow at 9 belonged to him. It did not. It belonged to me. I spent most of last year learning that injustice does not arrive like a storm, but more like a slow leak under the foundation, quiet at first, and then relentless, until everything you thought was solid begins to rot. And looking back from March 2024, I can see that the first crack appeared exactly 12 months earlier, when I was standing in the Round Rock kitchen, watching my mother stir pasta sauce, while Rick barked orders from the living room as if the entire house had been built by his hands and not by the mortgage my father left behind before he died, when I was just 15. And in that moment, I realized how easily a blended family in Texas can turn into a battlefield where the stepfather holds the loudest voice and the adult daughter becomes the convenient enemy, especially when that stepfather is a man who believes financial control equals power and who thinks loyalty is something a woman owes him simply because he married her mother. I remember the early days of 2019 when Mom thought she was gaining companionship after years of grief. Yet even then, Rick found ways to assert dominance. Small remarks about how my father spoiled me, comments about how women in blended families should learn to compromise, and beneath every sentence sat the message that my presence was an inconvenience. He tolerated only because he liked how my mother cooked. And as months passed, his favoritism toward his son Tyler intensified until it became the axis around which every argument in the house revolved. Tyler was 21 by the time this story truly started unraveling. Jobless, drifting between crypto schemes, convinced he was one trade away from becoming a millionaire, while in reality he carried $18,000 in credit card debt and a gambling habit he disguised as digital entrepreneurship. And Rick defended him every step of the way, insisting that the golden boy just needed time and a little help from the household, which was code for draining my mother's savings whenever Tyler made another disastrous financial choice. In contrast, I had carved out a stable life at 28, building my career in fraud analytics at Safeway FinTech in Austin, where my salary of $142,000 plus annual bonuses and RSUs reflected years of discipline and long nights learning to trace financial crime. Yet the more independent I became, the more Rick treated my achievements as a threat, repeating that bitter line that still echoes in my memory. My boy comes first. You are just independent. You do not need help. And with every repetition, he carved a deeper divide between me and the family I was trying to preserve. I began noticing patterns that triggered something familiar to every woman who has lived with a toxic stepfather. Subtle shifts like Rick paying the $380 car note for Tyler while demanding I cover the electric bill, because apparently high earners should contribute more. Or Rick telling Mom she needed a new water heater but expecting me to fund half of it, even though I barely use the house anymore, or the way he mocked me for renting a small apartment in North Austin for work, yet demanded I return home every weekend to show I was still part of the family, and each of these moments chipped away at my patience, but also sharpened my awareness, because my job at Safeway had taught me that patterns of abuse follow the same structure as patterns of fraud escalation, always small inconsistencies before the big grab. The turning point came in spring 2023 when Rick pressured Mom into refinancing the house to help Tyler pay off a crypto margin loan, and I watched as the man who claimed to be the head of the household persuaded her to add him as an authorized user on her checking account, a move that gave him full access to every dollar she earned. And that night, after everyone went to bed, I sat in my car outside the house and whispered to myself that I needed to start protecting the truth, the same way I protected victims of financial crime for a living. So I took out my phone and created a folder called Evidence Log. And that was the moment something inside me shifted from hurt to strategy. Over the next 12 months, from March 2023 to March 2024, I documented everything with a discipline no one in that house suspected, storing screenshots of text messages where Rick demanded money for home repairs that never happened, audio clips where he belittled me for not helping Tyler succeed notes about how Mom flinched whenever Rick raised his voice, and even the days he used the phrase family money as though my earnings and my savings somehow belonged to his golden boy by default, and every entry in my logs strengthened my resolve, because I knew abusive control often survives, not because victims are weak, but because evidence is fragile and easily twisted. But I refused to let that happen to me or to my mother. I told myself that if I ever needed to stand my ground, I would not do it with emotion alone. I would do it with documentation, timestamps, metadata, the very tools that had helped me expose dozens of fraudsters in my career. And as the months passed, I realized I was no longer just coping with a toxic stepfather, but quietly preparing for the day he would try to cross a line so bold, so unforgivable, that the truth I had gathered would become the only shield between us. And although I did not know the exact form that moment would take, I felt it approaching like a storm crest over Texas highways, heavy, slow, inevitable. By the time Rick began openly hinting that high earners in the family should contribute their fair share, meaning me and not his son, I already sensed where his greed was heading. And although he assumed I was just another quiet adult daughter trapped in a blended household power dynamic, he had no idea that I had been building a flawless record of every injustice for a full year. I carried that secret evidence with me everywhere I went, tucked inside encrypted folders on my laptop, mirrored on a private cloud server under a decoy name. And every time I added a new file, I felt something fierce awaken in me, a kind of steady confidence that abusive men rarely sense in the women they underestimate. And that confidence is what kept me calm the night he finally crossed the line and drained my mother's account. Because by then, the seed of injustice had already grown into the weapon I would use to dismantle everything he thought he controlled. I still remember the thick August heat that wrapped around San Marcos like a damp blanket as I pulled into my mother's driveway for the annual backyard BBQ, because even after months of feeling the slow, tightening grip of toxic family dynamics and hearing Rick remind anyone who would listen that his golden boy Tyler deserved every resource, while I, as the adult daughter who earned her own way, should stay quiet and grateful. I still tried to show up for my mother, so I walked through the side gate into the backyard where folding tables were scattered under string lights, and the smell of brisket drifted through the air, and I instantly felt dozens of eyes turn toward me, not with warmth, but with that familiar blend of curiosity and judgment that comes so easily in a Texas-blended family gathering where everyone knows everyone else's business, yet pretends they do not. Rick stood near the grill with a beer in his hand, red-faced and louder than he needed to be, and when he saw me approaching, he slapped the tongs down and called out in a booming voice meant to draw attention. "My stepdaughter is sitting on more money than all of us, can you believe that?" And the entire yard shifted as if gravity tilted toward his words. Conversations, stopping forks hovering over paper plates, older relatives squinting in my direction as though they had just discovered a new species they were not sure they liked. I felt the humiliation rise in my throat like a slow burn, because this was not the first time Rick had tried to expose me, yet this moment felt more calculating, more public, more violating, and I saw my mother frozen beside the picnic table, clutching a bowl of potato salad, her eyes darting away from mine, because she did not dare contradict him, not when Rick had already had 2 beers and was drifting into that dangerous zone between arrogance and anger. So I stayed still, even though my pulse hammered against my ribs, and I forced my voice steady as I said, "Rick, please stop." But he only laughed a sharp cutting sound and said, "Oh, come on, sweetheart. You hide money like a dragon guarding treasure, while my boy here is trying to rebuild his life and needs a little bit of help. Then Tyler swaggered into view wearing a tank top and that smug grin he used whenever he believed he held power over someone, which for him meant almost always. And before I could take another breath, he raised his phone and began a live stream on TikTok, turning the camera toward me as he announced, "Look, y'all, she is hiding family money. She is pretending she has nothing, but she is sitting on a secret pile of savings, and somehow they all think she is the victim." And the crowd behind him reacted with gasps and quiet murmurs, the kind that carried judgment and gossip in equal measure. So I stood there, feeling as if someone had stripped away every layer of privacy I ever had and exposed me to a yard full of people who did not know me but would gladly form opinions about me because humiliation spreads fast in tight Texas communities. I watched Tyler tilt his camera at me as if I were a spectacle and not a person, and I felt that crushing blend of anger and helplessness that so many women in toxic families know too well, the feeling of being talked over, controlled, dismissed, of having your narrative stolen and twisted into something convenient for the abuser. And when I glanced at my mother, her shoulders were hunched and her eyes were glossy with that familiar guilt and fear that had settled into her over the years she spent with Rick. And I knew she would not step in because she could not when she lived under his roof and walked on eggshells every single day. I felt every stare on my skin like heat from the grill, and yet beneath the humiliation, something inside me hardened, because while they thought they were exposing me, I knew the truth that I was already documenting every moment and every pattern of abuse and financial control that Rick and Tyler tried to enforce on me and my mother, because they believed I was powerless, but I had spent the last year quietly building a case in the shadows. So I lifted my phone, pretending to check a message, while I discreetly pressed the recording button, capturing the scene in crisp audio and video, as Rick rambled on about family obligations and how independent daughters like me should funnel resources to the real family, meaning his son and I kept my face blank, even though inside I felt the sting of betrayal sharper than ever. But behind that sting was something steadier, smarter, colder. The knowledge that this clip would join a digital folder already labeled BBQ0823 Evidence, a folder they would never see coming. Tyler kept filming until the comments turned against him because people online recognized a humiliation tactic when they saw one, and when he noticed the shift, he lowered his phone, muttering about people being too sensitive. Then he shot me a glare as though my refusal to crumble had personally offended him. The rest of the evening dragged in a haze of forced small talk and pointed whispers, and I stayed only long enough to avoid fueling more gossip. Then I finally slipped away into the warm night air, my chest tight, but my mind strangely clear, because this was the moment I understood that their cruelty was escalating, and the window for remaining passive had closed. As I drove back toward Round Rock with the evidence video saved securely on my encrypted drive, I knew deep down that the humiliation they had tried to brand into me would become the very thing they answered for. Not tonight, not tomorrow, but soon, because I had already started climbing my own path toward justice, and they did not even realize they had just handed me another piece of the puzzle. They thought they were controlling me, but they had no idea I was preparing for the day everything would turn. When January arrived and the air in Round Rock carried that brittle winter dryness that always made the house feel smaller than it already was, I came home from a long day at Safeway and found Rick sitting at the dining table with papers spread out, like he had just landed some powerful legal victory, even though he had never shown real interest in anything that required more than a signature and a complaint. And he looked at me with the smugness of someone who believed he had finally figured out a way to corner me financially and emotionally in the same breath. Then he pushed the stack toward me and said that since we were a blended household, the time had come to formalize our financial responsibilities, and that this document would ensure fairness and unity, which immediately set off alarms in my mind, because Rick did not care about fairness, and certainly not unity, unless it meant benefiting Tyler, who was leaning against the counter with a glass of milk and wearing that same sleepy, smirk he always put on when he expected someone else to pay the bill for his problems. And Rick tapped the top page and told me it was called the Texas Blended Household Financial Agreement, and that according to this paper, any adult daughter living under her parents' roof was required to allocate 40% of her monthly earnings to support the household and contribute equitably to the development of younger family members, which was his polite way of saying that he wanted my salary to float Tyler, while he continued to trade crypto on borrowed credit and play victim when trades went wrong. And I held the first page up to the light, letting my eyes drift along the font and the spacing, and something inside me warmed with a familiar kind of alertness. The same feeling I got at work when I caught a transaction that pretended to be legitimate, but slipped by with just enough off details to expose its true intent. And I noticed instantly that the header font did not match the body font, and the spacing between sections was irregular, as if copied from an online template written by someone who did not know the difference between a real statute and a convenient lie. Then my training with fraud detection kicked in, and I scanned the footer, noticing a faint shadow of metadata bleed on the lower corner, which meant I could probably guess when the file was created. And when I asked Rick how long he had been drafting this, he puffed out his chest and said weeks, even months, and that it was a careful project born out of his concern for the household. Yet Tyler turned his face away too fast, as if suppressing a laugh, which gave away the truth before I even opened the document properties. And the moment I clicked to reveal file details, my suspicion was confirmed because it showed the file was created exactly 3 hours earlier on a cheap laptop, whose digital signature matched the one Tyler used, which made everything feel both predictable and strangely empowering, since I could see their attempt to manipulate me laid out with such clumsy boldness right in front of me. And Rick mistook my silence for uncertainty and leaned closer to say that if I signed voluntarily, it would show maturity and family loyalty, and that refusing to sign would be deeply disappointing, which he said slowly while narrowing his eyes like he wanted to intimidate me into believing this was somehow a normal household negotiation, rather than a staged financial ambush aimed at my savings and my autonomy. And Tyler chimed in with his casual confidence, saying he was proud of Rick for finally taking charge, and that this agreement was only fair because I made more money than everyone else. And in that moment, I felt something detach inside me. Not sadness exactly, but a kind of cold clarity that made everything sharp around the edges. And instead of reacting or pushing back the way they expected, I let a small, polite smile form as if I were genuinely considering their offer, and Rick mistook that smile immediately his. Shoulders dropped slightly and his tone mellowed like he was speaking to someone he believed had finally surrendered. And he explained that after signing, I would have to schedule bi-weekly meetings with him to review my earnings contributions and long-term plans, which sounded less like household cooperation and more like full financial control, with a polite label slapped on top of it. And I nodded slowly, taking my time letting the silence stretch, until both of them looked almost comfortable before I gently placed the paper back on the table and said very softly that I would think about it, which was enough to make Rick give me a satisfied smile, the kind men give when they believe they have manipulated a situation successfully, and Tyler mumbled something about how smart people always recognize the right decision, eventually, then left the room humming as if he were genuinely celebrating a win, and the absurdity of the scene almost made me laugh out loud because neither of them noticed how easily the mask slipped when I turned away, or how quickly my expression changed to one of focused resolve as soon as I stepped into the hallway, since I already knew that this was not just another petty request or another insult hidden inside a demand. This was a clear escalation of control, a direct attempt to legalize their entitlement to my earnings. And by the time I walked into my room and closed the door quietly behind me, I had already made a mental outline of the evidence I needed to add to my collection, because this fake agreement was exactly the type of coercive tactic I had spent the past year quietly documenting and preserving with timestamps and backups across encrypted drives, knowing without admitting it even to myself that one day I might need a complete record of everything they had tried to take and everything they believed I would surrender without a fight. I thought the fake contract incident in January was the lowest point Rick and Tyler could sink to, but February proved that in a Texas household where financial control had become a silent weapon, there was always another layer of manipulation waiting in the dark. And as I moved through those days pretending to accept Rick's ridiculous document while secretly archiving every detail of his coercion, I kept telling myself that the worst thing he could do was pressure me during the day. I did not expect that the next attack would come while the entire house slept, because when someone is desperate for money and terrified of losing their golden boy status, they stop thinking in boundaries and start thinking in opportunities. And that is exactly what happened on the night of February 17th at 3:12 in the morning when the ceiling fan hummed above me and the room was warm enough that I had kicked half the blanket away. Drifting in and out of light sleep after a long day at Safewave FinTech, reviewing fraud logs for clients who had fallen victim to unauthorized entry attempts, not realizing that my own blended family would try something even more personal than anything in those case files, and as I lay there, the hallway floor creaked a sound so faint it could have been the house shifting, although something in my body tensed with the strange awareness that another human presence was moving closer. And then the door opened with only a whisper of sound, and I sensed Tyler stepping inside with the slow, uneven breaths of someone who believed he was doing something justified. Someone who felt entitled to put his hands on anything he wanted, including my financial life. Someone who had grown up hearing Rick say over and over that a stepdaughter should share everything with the real child of the house, so he must have decided that if I refused to be generous, voluntarily, he would simply find a way to force it. And as he approached the bed, I kept my eyes closed, because I wanted to know what he would do. My heart beat steady despite the rising sense of violation, and I felt the faint glow of a phone illuminating the side of my face, followed by the cold shadow of his hand holding my iPhone inches from my eyes as he lowered it slowly, hoping to get a quick face, unlock the exact same tactic I had seen desperate clients complain about when family members tried to steal their savings, a behavior Safewave had trained us to recognize as a form of hidden financial abuse committed inside households where trust had collapsed, and in that moment everything made sense because Tyler was not creative enough to invent strategies of his own. But he had clearly heard Rick rant about my account about the $280,000 they believed belonged to this family more than to me. So this was their next logical step. Try to access it directly at a moment when I was vulnerable and least likely to wake up. Except what Tyler did not know was that after I noticed repeated attempts on my login page in January, I had switched every security layer, changed my passcode, disabled face recognition, and installed a motion-triggered mini camera in my room that sent encrypted backups to a cloud folder he would never be able to reach. So as he held the phone in front of my face, nothing happened. The screen stayed locked and his breathing hitched with confusion as he tried again and again, pressing the side button impatiently, like the phone owed him obedience. And that was when I opened my eyes calmly, without moving my head, and stared up at him with the kind of stillness that makes a person realize they are caught, because he jerked backward instantly, nearly tripping over my desk chair, clutching the phone so tightly his knuckles went pale. And all the bravado he performed during the day disappeared, replaced by the sharp fear of a young man who finally understood he had crossed into a territory with real consequences. And I did not raise my voice or sit up abruptly. I simply said, "Tyler, you should leave the tone so measured and steady that he seemed even more scared." And he stumbled toward the door, mumbling something that sounded like I was just checking something, then fled into the hallway with a speed that made my heart pound, not out of fear, but out of the cold realization that this household had finally transformed from toxic to dangerous. And I waited until I heard his bedroom door slam before I reached for the mini camera hidden behind a stack of old books on the shelf, checking the timestamp because the device had captured everything. The slow entry. The attempted face unlocked the moment he realized he had been recorded, all stored in a file that automatically synced to my off-site backup location, where neither Rick nor Tyler could ever reach it. And as I replayed the clip quietly, the sense of humiliation from the August backyard party, combined with the anger from the fake financial agreement and twisted into something sharper, something clearer, because this was no longer just blended family pettiness. It was unauthorized entry, attempted digital access, and intentional financial coercion. And I knew from my experience at SafeWave that these behaviors created a very strong evidentiary pattern, exactly the kind of pattern attorneys could use in Texas cases involving economic manipulation inside adult daughter abuse situations. So I saved the file under a very specific name that only I would understand, something simple, like February 17 Evidence Pack. And I sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment, letting the weight of everything settle in my chest as I realized that every step Rick and Tyler made to intimidate me was giving me something more powerful than fear. They were giving me documentation. They were giving me proof. And for the first time in years, I felt the faintest spark of control returning as I closed my eyes and breathed deeply, because I knew I was no longer reacting. I was preparing quietly, intelligently, gathering every piece I needed, and while they moved through the house, believing they controlled everything, believing I was trapped, believing I would eventually surrender my savings to the golden boy narrative they clung to. I was building a case that would eventually flip the entire dynamic, though they could not possibly imagine that the woman they underestimated had been preparing her escape route since the first time Rick told me in early 2023 that his boy came first. And as the digital clock changed from 3:30 to 3:31, I finally lay back down calmer than I had been all month, holding the knowledge that their latest attempt to steal from me had just become the piece that completed the pattern, the proof that would let me walk away cleanly and make them face the consequences of what they had done. I remember the night everything inside that house shifted into something colder than silence, a kind of quiet that felt like someone had taken the air out of every room. And it started the week after Tyler tried unlocking my phone at 3 a.m, because that incident had left a crack in the illusion Rick used to control the house. And once a crack appears in toxic families, they often react by tightening their grip even harder, which is exactly what Rick did the moment he realized I was not as easy to manipulate as my mother. I came home from work on a Tuesday evening tired in the way only someone who works long hours in a Texas fintech fraud unit can understand, the kind of exhaustion that settles behind your eyes, hoping to shower, eat something simple, maybe review the new batch of security anomalies the SafeWave server flagged. But the moment I opened my bedroom door, I realized the power was out. Not the whole house, just my room. The hallway light was on. The kitchen was lit, but mine was completely dark, as if someone had carved it out of the electrical grid. I flicked the switch, twice nothing happened, and before I could even process the feeling sinking in my stomach, Rick yelled from the living room without even bothering to look away from the TV, his voice dripping with that dismissive Texas drawl he used whenever he wanted to show dominance, saying it must be a wiring issue and that maybe if I contributed more for household upkeep, the breaker would magically start working again. And even though he said it like a joke, the threat beneath it was sharp enough to cut. I stood there in the dark, the air heavy and still feeling less like a daughter, and more like an unwanted tenant who missed a rent payment. And when I walked to the breaker box near the laundry room, I saw the small strip of masking tape Rick had placed on my switch, scribbled with the word unnecessary. The final confirmation that this was not a malfunction but a punishment, a form of quiet retaliation meant to remind me that he believed he controlled every inch of this blended family home. My mother appeared behind me, her voice soft and trembling as she asked if everything was all right, though she did not need an answer because she could see the breaker and that stupid piece of tape as clearly as I did, but she still whispered that maybe it was better not to make it worse because she could not take another shouting match, not after the night in 2022 when Rick slammed his fists into the kitchen table so hard the legs cracked. I wanted to ask her how much worse things needed to get before she saw the pattern, before she realized this was not a temporary storm, but the climate of the house. Yet I swallowed the words, the way adult daughters in toxic homes are trained to do, choosing instead to nod and say it was fine, even though inside I felt something unraveling. The next morning I noticed another change, subtle but unmistakable. My mail was missing. Not junk mail, not ads, but the important things, envelopes from my bank, tax documents, SafeWave HR notices items that always came around this time of year. Yet the mailbox was strangely empty, and when I asked my mother if she had seen any mail for me, she hesitated before admitting that Rick might have sorted things earlier, but she was not sure which was her way of saying she had seen something she did not dare interfere with. I found 2 envelopes later tucked behind the microwave of all places, open, torn just enough to reveal the top lines, which told me Rick was either trying to monitor my finances or searching for something he could twist into leverage. And for a moment, my chest tightened with the realization that I was being cornered in my own home-isolated room, by room detail, by detail, in the same quiet, methodical way fraudsters corner their victims. Every evening that week, Rick found a new way to remind me I was unwelcome, unless I followed his rules, whether by turning off the hot water before I showered, taking the spare key to prevent me from entering quietly, or making remarks at dinner about how adult daughters who live at home should pay for repairs since they do not have families of their own, each comment punctuated by Tyler smirking into his plate as if he were watching his favorite show. My mother apologized whenever she could catch me alone, her voice damp with guilt as she said she wished she could fix it, but she was afraid of his temper, afraid of what he might do if she pushed back, afraid because she had spent years convincing herself this was normal Texas household tension and not the slow tightening of financial control. And I realized in that moment that I was not just fighting for myself, I was also fighting for the woman who had never learned how to fight for herself. By the end of that week, the sense of isolation had grown so thick I could feel it pressing against my skin. But the thing about working in fraud prevention is that isolation looks a lot like a precursor to escalation. And rather than break me, it sharpened me. So one night, while Rick and Tyler argued over some crypto channel on the living room TV, I sat on my unlit bed, opened my SafeWave employee portal, and clicked the link for the confidential employee protection program, the one designed for staff dealing with harassment or financial coercion, a resource I had never imagined needing for my own home. Yet there, I was typing out a brief message to the attorney assigned to internal safety cases, Clara Moreno, explaining that I needed guidance, not dramatic action, just clarity on legal boundaries in Texas households. Within 30 minutes, she replied asking for a call, her message calm and steady, saying that many adult daughters in blended families face similar patterns, especially in situations involving money disputes and reading. That line felt like someone had reached into the dark tunnel and handed me a small light. I scheduled the call for the next morning, and for the first time in months, I felt something other than fear, something closer to resolve. Because once someone like me starts documenting and preparing, the balance of power begins to shift even before the other side knows it. And as I closed the laptop, I realized that the darkness of that house was only pushing me closer to the exit I should have taken a long time ago. I stood in the same kitchen where 2 hours earlier my mother had whispered that my stepfather had taken every dollar from her checking account, and I felt the weight of every year I had spent swallowing my voice just to keep the peace in a house that was never really mine. And as Rick leaned forward with that familiar smirk tightening the corners of his mouth, I realized that everything up to this moment had been the climb toward a drop I could no longer avoid. and I could taste the metallic tension in the air while Tyler hovered near the doorway, rubbing his hands together like someone who expected to watch a show rather than witness the unraveling of the control he and his father believed they had earned. Rick set both palms on the counter and said in a slow, heavy voice that he thought would dominate the room that it was time for me to do what was right for the family and transfer a large part of my savings into the shared household account. And before he even finished the sentence, he lifted his chin like he already owned my response, because people like him always assume obedience from the quiet one. And I felt the ache of years when I had let him believe that silence meant surrender. But tonight that silence felt like a rope I was finally ready to cut. He told me again to be reasonable, reminding me that Tyler needed a restart in life, and that my mother needed support, and that my salary was more than enough to cover everything. And when he added that cruel line, "You do not need that money anyway," I felt something inside me become incredibly still, and in that stillness, I realized I no longer feared any reaction he might have, and I no longer felt responsible for carrying peace alone. I looked at my mother, whose shoulders were trembling, and who could not meet my eyes, because she already knew she would ask me later to forgive him, and to be patient, and to remember that he had been under stress. But even she seemed to sense that something had shifted in me after the events of last night, when their attempt to break into my account had been recorded and flagged by my company's security system. Rick leaned closer and snapped his fingers like I was a child refusing a chore, and then he barked that he wanted the transfer done by midnight, and that if I chose to live under his roof, then I had obligations. Something in the phrasing made my breath catch and then release slowly, because for the first time I could hear how rehearsed his control had been, how practiced his entitlement sounded, how comfortable he was taking from women who were worn down and afraid of conflict. Tyler laughed lightly as if we were playing some family game, and he added that my upcoming bonus would cover anything I lost today, so there was no need to make a big scene. And when he said bonus, he dragged out the word because he thought it was clever to mock the career that paid every bill in this house, while he spent his days avoiding responsibilities. I straightened my back, letting the silence build until both of them shifted their footing, uncertain and impatient. And when I finally spoke, my voice came out steady enough to surprise even me as I said no, and let the word hang in the air like a stone dropping into still water. Rick blinked once as if he had heard wrong, and he asked me to repeat myself, and I did, saying not anymore, "This ends tonight." And Tyler muttered something sharp under his breath, but I did not look at him. I kept my eyes on Rick, whose face went from shock to red-flushed anger in a breath as he slammed his palm onto the counter, loud enough to make my mother jump, and he told me I did not get to talk to him like that because he had kept a roof over my head and food in my mouth. I reminded him that I paid rent every month and contributed groceries and utilities, and that I had been financially independent since I was 22, while Tyler had never held a job longer than a week, and Rick barked that family was not about keeping score. It was about supporting each other, and that his son deserved a fair chance. I let him finish, and then without raising my voice, I reached into my pocket, tapped my phone twice, and said it was interesting that he wanted to talk about fairness, because fairness would also require honesty. And I watched the exact moment he realized something was wrong, because his posture tightened, and he asked what I meant. But I did not explain. I simply rotated the phone so they could see the red, blinking light that indicated the audio recorder was active, and that everything said, since the moment Rick demanded money had been captured. His skin drained of color, his mouth opened and closed like he was searching for a different tone, but Tyler stepped back, nearly knocking over a dining chair as he realized the implications and tried to whisper something to him. Rick attempted to recover, saying I had no right to record this conversation in his home, but his voice cracked mid-sentence because he remembered what I did for a living and he knew I understood the laws better than he did. And I told him calmly that Texas was a one-party consent state and that everything had been recorded legally. I saw my mother bring her hands to her mouth, her eyes full of confusion and shame and fear that things had finally escalated beyond the point where she could smooth them back down. I walked to the table where my laptop sat from earlier, and without breaking eye contact, I selected the files from the previous weeks, including the fake contract he had tried to pass as legal, the secret attempt to use my Face ID, the repeated login attempts from inside the house, and the financial manipulation stretching back months. And I attached them to an email addressed to Clara Moreno, whose name alone made Rick step back, because he recognized it from the legal notice that SafeWave had sent him when he attempted unauthorized access to my account. I hit send and told him that since he wanted everything done tonight, I had complied. He stared at me without speaking, his eyes flicking from me to the phone to the laptop to my mother, who now cried openly because she knew something irreversible had begun. And as I turned to walk upstairs, he reached out as if to grab my arm but stopped short because he saw the phone still in my hand, still recording, still blinking, and I told him quietly that he would never speak to me like this again and that this house was no longer my responsibility. I left the kitchen, hearing only my mother whispering my name, while Rick muttered that I had no idea what I had just done. And as I stepped into the hallway, I whispered to myself that finally, for the first time in years, I truly did. When March 14th arrived, I drove to the Travis County Dispute Resolution Center with the same steady breath I used whenever I had to testify in fraud review meetings at SafeWave, and I kept my shoulders squared as the warm Texas wind pushed against my back, reminding me that whatever happened inside this building was not just a confrontation, but the moment the truth would finally be seen without filters or excuses. And I walked into the lobby, holding my laptop like a shield, while my attorney Clara Moreno waited beside the reception desk with a calm look that told me she already expected resistance from Rick. And she leaned slightly toward me as we headed to the mediation room and said that cases like this often exposed more financial deception than the victims ever knew. And I nodded because after everything I had uncovered during the past year, I believed her completely, even though part of me was still bracing for the emotional hit of seeing my mother look torn between love and fear. And when the door opened, I stepped inside, first watching Rick straighten his back as if this room were another one of his job sites, where shouting and intimidation got him whatever he wanted, and he smirked when he saw me tapping the folder in front of him as if it contained irrefutable proof of something grand, while Tyler slouched in the chair beside him, eyes darting to the carpet the same way they did whenever accountability was about to land on him. And my mother, Linda, sat at the far end of the table with her hands clasped tight enough that her knuckles were pale, whispering my name with a trembling voice. But I stayed standing, letting the silence stretch, long enough for Rick to lose even a bit of confidence. And finally, the mediator, an older man with a measured tone, introduced himself and asked us to sit. And when we did, Rick immediately leaned forward and launched into a speech about family responsibility and how I was refusing to contribute fairly to a blended household, repeating phrases that sounded rehearsed and almost proud, saying he had every right to expect support from me because I had more money than anyone else in the home. And he insisted that I had provoked conflict by being selfish, but Clara raised a hand gently and said we would respond after reviewing the items we had prepared. And when the mediator nodded to me, I opened my laptop, slowly rotating the screen toward the table, and said that before anyone discussed fairness, we needed to address the continuous attempts to access my private financial accounts, which made Rick huff and roll his eyes. But when I clicked open the first folder labeled Login Attempt Logs, his smirk began to fade as rows of timestamps and IP addresses filled the screen, each one tied directly to the home network he controlled, and the mediator leaned closer, asking me to explain the technical details. So I walked him through how SafeWave systems flagged unauthorized attempts and created a trail of digital evidence, and Tyler muttered something under his breath. But I ignored him and opened the next file, the one time-stamped 3:12 in the morning on February 17th. And as the clip began to play, the room held its breath, showing Tyler entering my room while I slept. Lifting my phone from the nightstand and trying to position it near my face, his silhouette illuminated by the small camera I had hidden, and my mother gasped with a sound that cracked in the center, as if something inside her broke open, while the mediator sat frozen, glancing between me and Tyler, whose face had gone stiff and colorless, and Rick slammed his palm on the table, insisting the video was fake. But Clara calmly asked him how I could have fabricated a security camera angle that clearly showed the hallway light reflecting behind him as he waited outside, and before he could protest, I clicked into the third folder, the one containing the metadata from the fake financial agreement he had tried to make me sign, and I enlarged the section, showing the document creation timestamp, which displayed 3 hours before he printed it, along with the author tag that still bore his username. And I explained that no Texas statute recognized anything resembling the so-called blended household requirement he claimed, and the mediator pressed his lips together, exhaling slowly, clearly aware this was no misunderstanding, but a coordinated attempt at coercion. And I could feel the tension rising in the room, like heat waves on asphalt, each piece of evidence sharpening the reality of what Rick and Tyler had done. And when I played the audio clip from August during the family barbecue, where Tyler announced to his live stream viewers that I was hiding family money, while Rick encouraged him, the mediator shook his head and scribbled notes furiously, then asked Rick if he understood that public humiliation designed to force financial compliance fit the definition of coercive abuse under multiple Texas guidelines. And Rick sputtered incoherently, saying I was making him look bad. But Clara picked up a printed page and read directly from Texas Penal Code Section 32, which addressed financial fraud and manipulative tactics intended to obtain money from an adult family member, and she placed the document gently on the table in front of the mediator, who nodded and said the statute absolutely applied here. And my mother covered her face as tears slid between her fingers, because it was the first time she had heard a neutral professional describe Rick's behavior with formal legal language instead of excuses. And as Rick leaned back, trying to regain some control, he demanded to know what I wanted, saying we could settle this privately if I stopped being dramatic. But instead of answering, I reached into my bag and withdrew a sealed envelope stamped with the notary mark, laying it on the table and sliding it toward the mediator, explaining that this was the confirmation of a newly established trust fund designed specifically for my mother, guaranteeing her financial independence separate from Rick. And when I said that the trust would be funded using assets I had built on my own, through years of disciplined saving and the growth of my SafeWave RSUs, the entire room shifted. Because for the first time, Rick understood the truth he had never grasped, which was that I was not the vulnerable target he assumed, but someone who had built a foundation so stable he had no power to shake it anymore. And Tyler stood up abruptly as if he needed to escape, but the mediator asked him to sit, because proceedings were not finished, and my mother looked at me with a mix of pain and awe, as if she were seeing her daughter clearly for the first time in years. And as I closed the laptop slowly, I felt the air settle into something different, something irreversible, because the truth was now out in the open, where lies could not cover it anymore. And Rick finally looked away, unable to meet my eyes, while the mediator began outlining the next legal steps, and I sat still, letting the weight of the moment sink in as the entire room realized that this was the day everything changed. By early April, the air in Round Rock carried the thick humidity that always arrived before the real Texas heat settled in. And as I moved through those first weeks after the mediation hearing, I felt the slow shifting of power around me, like the temperature rising subtle at first, then impossible to ignore because word spread faster than I expected. And suddenly, every person connected to the Hale family saga seemed to know that Rick had been exposed for financial coercion and fraudulent behavior. And even though no one said anything to my face, I could feel the eyes on me each time I stopped for groceries or filled my gas tank, the quiet, curious looks that whispered. She finally stood up for herself. While for Rick, the consequences came much louder since the civil suit filed by my attorney moved quickly, and the court accepted all 5 pieces of evidence without hesitation, which led to the immediate freezing of his personal account, along with the secondary household account he used to move money around, leaving him furious and desperate and stomping through the house like a man trying to kick down a door that no longer opened for him. And a week after that, the foreman at his construction site suspended him pending investigation because the local union leaders had heard murmurs about financial misconduct and domestic instability, which they considered a liability on active work sites. And although they did not fire him outright, they made it clear that his name was no longer trusted, which meant every project supervisor silently agreed to stop calling him in for shifts, creating a vacuum of income that he had no idea how to fill. Then Tyler's world collapsed in its own messy way because SafeWave's legal advisory board reviewed the footage of the Face ID attempt and determined that he posed an ongoing digital security risk, so they drafted a strong recommendation letter to the Austin Digital Compliance Bureau, who then issued a temporary ban preventing him from trading or holding crypto for 6 months, which sounded almost humorous on paper. But for him, it was catastrophic, since crypto trading was the only identity he clung to. And now, even that was taken away, leaving him pacing the house in circles, complaining about how unfair life was, while still refusing to admit he had done anything wrong. And in this chaotic fallout, my mother became the ghost wandering between their collapsing egos and my silent departure. Because after the mediation ended, I went back to the house only once to gather my belongings, then moved into a small apartment in North Austin with beige carpeting and a balcony that faced a line of maple trees, a quiet place where my phone stayed on, do not disturb, and the air finally felt breathable. And for weeks I avoided her calls because the sound of her voice pulled open too many wounds. But one evening in late May, she showed up outside my building, holding a grocery bag of things she said I left behind, which I knew was just an excuse to see me, her eyes puffy and her shoulders lowered like she'd been carrying a weight far heavier than I ever realized. And she whispered, "I did not protect you," which landed in the middle of my chest with a dull ache, because even though part of me wanted to comfort her, another part still remembered how she stood silent while Rick tried to dismantle everything I built. So I told her quietly, "You could not, but I can protect myself now." And it was not meant to be cruel, but honest, the kind of honesty that comes after years of swallowing pain until it no longer fits inside your body. And she nodded as if she understood, though I could tell she still lived in the shadow of the man who had drained her accounts and pushed her into corners she could not escape. And when she left that night, I watched her walk down the dim hallway with the slow, tired steps of someone who did not know how to save herself yet. And I felt a strange mix of sorrow and relief, because stepping away from that house was the first step toward reclaiming my life. And in the quiet of my new apartment, with nothing but the hum of the refrigerator and the faint noise from the highway, I realized that even though the fallout was messy and loud and painful, there was something freeing about watching the structures that once trapped me break apart in the open under their own weight. And as June arrived with long, bright days, I finally felt the smallest spark of peace returning, subtle but real, like a single light switching on after months of darkness. When July 2024 arrived, I felt as if a long, oppressive weight had finally lifted from my shoulders. And as I drove north on I-35 toward my new life in Austin, with the windows cracked open and the sun beaming across the highway, I kept thinking about how March had felt like the end of everything. Yet only 4 months later, something in me was opening again, as if fresh air had finally reached a room that had been shut too long. And the moment I stepped into my new apartment on North Lamar with its pale walls and wide windows and that faint scent of new carpet, I understood I had crossed a boundary that I could never return from. And I whispered to myself that this was my space, my air, my peace, and my beginning. And even though the apartment was small by Austin standards, with a narrow balcony overlooking the parking lot of a coffee shop, it felt enormous because it belonged only to me. And for the first time in years, I was not tiptoeing around the moods of a man who believed control was a birthright, nor bracing myself for Tyler to demand something, nor waiting for another envelope to disappear from the mailbox, and I rearranged the boxes in the living room, slowly knowing that every object had crossed the threshold as part of a life I had chosen, not a life I had been cornered into. And each evening, as the temperature fell into that soft, warm Texas dusk, I would sit on the balcony with my laptop reviewing SafeWave case logs, planning strategies for the fraud analytics team, and wondering how I had held myself together all those months under the roof in Round Rock, where silence felt sharp and every footstep came with a sense of being watched and measured and taken for granted. SafeWave had noticed the shift in me. And maybe it was because I finally had room to breathe, or because the chaos at home had hardened something inside me that translated into precision and drive. But by late July, my director called me into a small glass meeting room overlooking the river and told me the company was expanding the fraud analytics division ahead of the anticipated IPO, and they needed a team lead who understood both pattern recognition and the psychology of financial coercion. And when she said my name, there was a moment when I wanted to look behind me to see if she meant someone else, but she smiled and said I had been outperforming every metric since March, and the leadership team wanted to give me a bigger role, and I nodded slowly because deep inside, I felt something rising, a quiet confidence that had been suppressed for so long and now could finally surface. The promotion came with a raise and an expansion of my RSUs, and although I tried to stay professional, the number made my pulse skip, because I understood how fintech equity moves, especially in an Austin company preparing a quiet filing. And when the valuation estimates began circulating in September, and the analysts hinted that our RSUs could multiply if the offering landed well, I started to realize that my life was not just shifting, it was accelerating. I spent evenings reading through the IPO chatter, those long investor threads filled with speculation. And as fall arrived, I found myself watching SafeWave stock projections jump from modest to ambitious, then from ambitious to astonishing. And by November, when a reputable financial site estimated the equity pool for mid-level analysts at nearly 6 times its 2023 value, I sat still on my couch, with my phone glowing in my hand, and whispered a quiet thank you to a life that refused to crush me no matter how hard Rick and Tyler had tried. With my savings stable and my RSUs climbing at a pace I had never imagined, I drove out one Saturday morning to tour a new townhome development near North Austin, where the sidewalks were lined with young trees, and the sales agent walked me through a 2-story home with natural light flooding the stairwell and a kitchen window that looked out toward a small grassy field. Something in my chest tightened in a way I had not felt since childhood, when home meant safety rather than survival, and I knew that if I walked away from this property, I would regret it for the rest of my life. So I signed the offer with a hand that trembled slightly, and 36 days later, I stood inside my own townhome, turning the key slowly and feeling the gravity of what it meant that the deed held only my name, without conditions or threats or anyone else claiming a piece of what I had built. The first night in the townhome felt almost unreal, and when I lay on the living room floor on a makeshift mattress, listening to the faint chirp of crickets outside, I realized that I was no longer living in reaction to anyone else. I was shaping a world by my own design, and even the silence felt full, not empty. It was 2 weeks after move-in when I visited the Austin Animal Center because I wanted something alive in this new space, and that is where I met Orbit, a small tan rescue dog with oversized ears and a nervous trot, who looked at me with a cautious hopefulness and curled against my leg when I knelt beside him. And in that moment, I felt something soften inside me, as if the universe were returning a small piece of gentleness I had been denied for years. So I filled out the adoption papers and took him home, where he circled every room, sniffing the corners, before collapsing beside me on the rug as if he had been waiting for peace too. As winter settled over Texas, I found myself stepping deeper into a version of life I once believed belonged only to other women. Women who got to breathe without being told their worth was tied to someone else. And at the library downtown, I began hosting small Saturday workshops for women facing financial abuse, teaching them about credit protection, account separation, and data privacy, because I knew what it felt like to be cornered quietly, and I wanted them to feel the same steady ground I was learning to walk on. Every session reminded me of where I had been and where I stood now, and each time I drove home with Orbit asleep in the passenger seat, I felt that strange mix of gratitude and disbelief. Because the world that had once tried to shrink me was now the world I was growing beyond. And every day from July 2024 to March 2025 felt like one long, steady step into a freedom that no one could take from me again. I had spent nearly a full year rebuilding my life on my own terms, creating a rhythm inside the quiet North Austin townhouse that felt nothing like the tight, fearful breaths I used to take in that Round Rock house. And by May 2025, the air around me had changed completely, as the evening softened with early summer warmth and the sky turned its familiar Texas lavender. Yet even with the calm I had earned, I knew in my gut that people like Rick never leave well enough alone. And my suspicion proved right. One Thursday morning, when my phone began vibrating insistently against my kitchen counter, while I was making coffee before heading to the SafeWave office, and I glanced at the screen only to see a number I had deleted months ago, but recognized instantly, because no adult daughter who has survived a toxic household ever forgets the rhythm of those unwelcome digits. So I let it ring out once, but it came again and again until I finally pressed, except merely to end the noise. And before I could speak, I heard Rick breathing heavily as if he had been pacing. Then his voice came through, coated in that same condescending entitlement I remembered all too well. Though now there was a panic beneath it. And he said, "Maya, we are family, and family shows up when things get hard, and I need your help just this once." And I leaned against the counter in utter disbelief at how easily the man who tried to take everything from me had rearranged the narrative in his mind. But before I could reply, he kept speaking quickly, words spilling over themselves as he insisted Tyler was in trouble, that some crypto trading group was threatening legal action, that charges had been filed for deceptive transactions, that lawyers wanted fees up front, and they did not have the money, and everything was spiraling. And I could almost see him standing in that dated Round Rock kitchen, clutching his phone with the same arrogance he used to weaponize against me now, cracked open by consequences he never expected. And while he rambled about court dates and restitution, I felt an old but faint ache tug in my chest, because even after all he had done, my mind flickered to my mother, and I wondered how much she was enduring yet before I could process fully Rick's voice sharpened into demand as he said, "I know you have the money, you bought a new place. You think people do not hear things, but we do, and you need to step up because Tyler is your brother, and he deserves a second chance." And that was the line that broke the last thread of patience I ever had for this man, because even in desperation, his instinct was to guilt, shackle me into responsibility for the boy he always elevated at my expense. So I said nothing and instead waited in silence until he wilted under it and finally muttered, "Maya, please. I am asking you respectfully," which was the closest I had ever heard him get to humility. But I refused to let old patterns take root and ended the call by simply saying, "I cannot help you," then hung up before he could twist my words into something else. I barely had time to exhale when my phone buzzed again this time with a voice note, and the preview showed Tyler's name, a name that used to make my stomach tighten because of the humiliation he had put me through, and although I wanted to delete it without listening. Some wounded part of me needed to hear his tone, maybe to confirm to myself that I had closed this chapter for good, so I pressed play and heard him sobbing in the cramped, shaky way of a young man who had been insulated from accountability, his entire life saying, "Maya, I know I messed up and I am sorry for everything. Please help Mom. She is scared, and I promise I will pay you back one day, I swear." And he kept repeating, "Please, please help Mom," until the note ended abruptly with a sniffle that almost sounded rehearsed. And while a small part of me felt a pang for my mother, the rest of me knew the truth embedded in every abusive household, which is that guilt only flows downward and never upward. And if I opened the door even 1 inch, the entire weight of their chaos would flood my life again. I stood in my quiet kitchen with the sunlight filtering through the blinds and the air filled with the soft whirring of the refrigerator, and I realized that peace is something you fight for repeatedly, and boundaries are not built once, but maintained every day. So I opened the phone settings, slowly, deliberately breathing evenly as I scrolled through the list of recent calls and messages from Rick and Tyler, and I blocked every number attached to them. Then I blocked the landline they used at the house and the secondary prepaid Tyler had used months before. And then for the first time, I did something I had never allowed myself to consider. I blocked my mother as well because I knew she would be pulled to guilt, pressure me even if she did not want to. And as the final confirmation appeared on my screen, a wave of both sadness and relief washed through me, because choosing myself did not require hating them. It only required refusing to let their dysfunction dictate my life any longer. I placed the phone face down on the counter and felt the stillness around me settle like a warm blanket, and as I grabbed my keys and headed toward the door, I whispered to myself a truth I had earned through every wound and every step forward, that family does not steal from family, and anyone who does loses the privilege of calling themselves mine. And with that quiet declaration, I left the house, ready to step into the next chapter of a life they would never control again. I remember the heat of early July settling over Austin in a way that felt almost heavy enough to press against my shoulders. Yet the night my mother appeared at my front door just after 10, with her clothes soaked through and her hair plastered to her cheeks, under the pounding Texas rain, carried a chill that ran straight through my chest. Because when I opened the door and saw her trembling on the porch, with her purse clutched to her chest like a shield, she whispered, "I left him," in a voice so fragile it felt like a thread stretching between us. And as the storm cracked behind her, I realized this was the moment I had been waiting for without admitting it. Even to myself, the moment where years of being trapped in a toxic blended family, years of watching Rick tighten his grip on her finances, her routines and her confidence that had once been so bright, finally snapped under the same weight that had once threatened to crush me too. So I reached out and pulled her inside, where the air was warm, and Orbit trotted over with worried eyes as if he sensed something life-changing happening in real time, and my mother collapsed against me with a sob, muffled into my shoulder while water dripped from her sleeves onto the hardwood floor. And all I could think was that she had finally broken free from the man who weaponized the idea of family, the man who believed financial control equaled power, the man who drained her checking account and tried to seize my savings and demanded obedience from anyone unfortunate enough to live under his roof. And as we moved toward the couch, she told me in halting breaths how the last few months had been unbearable, with Rick losing work after the dispute resolution hearing, losing friends in the construction community after the rumors about coercion and financial fraud circulated, losing control of their finances once the court temporarily froze his access due to the civil lawsuit I had filed, and how those losses had turned into resentment that he hurled at her day after day until she finally packed a bag when he stormed out to meet a loan officer earlier that evening to find a way to cover the $52,000 Tyler owed after the crypto scam investigation caught up to him. And she said she knew he would try to pull her into that mess too, because he always did, and she was tired of apologizing for him, tired of being afraid of him, tired of carrying the shame he created and calling it marriage. So she drove in the storm until she reached my place, her voice breaking as she admitted she should have left years ago when she first saw how he treated me, how he praised Tyler as if he were a king while talking down to me with comments like, "You are too independent for your own good," or "My boy needs more than you do because he is family." And I told her softly that she was here now, and that was what mattered. Because healing is not about timing. It is about the moment a person finally chooses themselves. And she looked at me with eyes swollen from tears and asked quietly if she could stay for a few days until she figured out her next step. And I felt something steady rise inside me as I answered, "Yes, of course you can stay as long as you need, because this home is safe, and I will not let him take anything else from you." And after I settled her in the guest room, I retrieved the manila folder that had been sitting in my desk drawer for months, the one labeled Linda Hale Trust in clean black ink, because I always knew a day might come when she needed a door to walk through. So when she emerged from the room after washing her face and changing into dry clothes, I told her we needed to talk about her financial independence. And she looked confused at first until I explained carefully that I had already opened a trust in her name using part of my stock option gains from Safewave, not to control her, not to dictate her choices, but to give her a foundation that Rick could never access and never weaponize. And she covered her mouth with shaking fingers as I told her the trust included a fully funded emergency account, prepaid rent options if she wanted her own apartment, and legal support if she chose to finalize a separation or pursue protective orders. And she whispered, "I do not deserve this," but I shook my head and said, "You deserve so much more." Because the truth is, women who survive financial abuse often feel like their worth has been chipped away $1 at a time. But the moment they regain control over their money, they also regain control over their lives. And as she cried into her hands, I felt something inside me settle, something like a knot loosening after being pulled too tight for too long. Because after all the damage, after all the humiliation and manipulation and long nights where she had chosen him over her own well-being and mine, she had finally chosen herself, and I was proud of her in a way I could not fully articulate. So we sat together on the couch, listening to the storm soften outside, while Orbit curled at our feet, and my mother leaned her head on my shoulder and whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on me," and I told her I never would, but I did have to give up on Rick because boundaries are not cruelty. They are survival, and the peace in the room felt fragile but real. The kind of peace that grows slowly after years of chaos, and as the quiet stretched between us, I realized this was poetic justice in its truest form. Not revenge for the sake of winning, but the restoration of something a toxic family had tried to strip away. The quiet return of dignity and safety and choice, which, for women like my mother, meant everything. September 2025 arrived with a softness I had not felt in years, a kind of quiet that settled over my mornings in North Austin, where the sunlight filtered through the blinds in wide, gentle bands, and the only sound was Orbit nudging my ankle, as if reminding me that life could begin again without fear or the weight of someone else's expectations pressing into my chest. And when the email from Safewave appeared on my phone announcing the official completion of the company's public offering, I sat at my kitchen island in the townhome I had purchased alone and stared at the numbers long enough for my breath to catch, because the 7-figure total now displayed in my vested RSUs meant that every late night, every ignored insult, every quiet moment of endurance was finally materializing into something solid and safe. And mine, and I felt an unexpected stillness spread through my body, as if some internal battle had just declared an armistice, allowing me to settle into a deeper understanding that financial freedom was not simply about the money itself, but about having the agency to decide who could speak into my life and who no longer had the right to stand at my door. I moved through the kitchen slowly that morning, making coffee and opening windows and feeling the September air drift in from the small patio where the plants I had kept alive for the first time in my adult life brushed against each other in a soft rustle, and I thought about how far I had come since March, when Rick had stood in my mother's kitchen and declared that my savings were family property, and the absurdity of it almost made me laugh because at the time I had felt cornered and outnumbered. Yet even in that moment, some quiet part of me had already been preparing a path out of that house and into a life that would never again be defined by a man's temper or a boy's entitlement or a mother's whispered fear. As I sipped my coffee, I remembered the way my mother had arrived at my door months earlier, soaked from the rain and trembling with exhaustion after finally leaving Rick, and how she had collapsed into my arms as if she'd been holding her breath for years. And I realized again that healing does not unfold in a straight line, but in small, repeated choices. Sometimes quiet ones like reaching for help, or turning off a phone, or signing your own lease for the first time. And sometimes louder ones like saying no in a room full of people who once expected your obedience. The townhome had become a sanctuary where my mother and I rebuilt what had been damaged by years of blended family chaos and financial control. And as I watched her grow steadier with each passing week, I understood that the trust fund I created for her was more than a financial structure. It was a declaration that she no longer had to rely on someone who mistook dominance for love. And I no longer had to carry the guilt of leaving her behind, since now she had a foundation that belonged solely to her. On mornings when she joined me on the trail behind the neighborhood and Orbit trotted ahead with his tail curved like a question mark, I felt a rising gratitude for the ordinary calm of our routine, because it was the kind of calm I used to envy in other families, the kind that seemed unreachable when I lived under Rick's roof, where every conversation felt like a negotiation and every decision felt like a test of loyalty. But now, in the wide expanse of Texas sky and the new rhythm of my life, I felt that old anxiety melt from my shoulders with each mile. At work, my promotion had settled into a natural stride, and I found myself mentoring younger analysts, many of them women who confided in me that they stayed in jobs or relationships that drained them because they feared the consequences of stepping away, and I told them gently that I understood the hesitation, but that there is a strength that reveals itself only when you refuse to let someone else define your value. And their nods told me they heard something they had needed for a long time. When the news of Safewave's successful IPO reached the team, I watched their excitement ripple through the office, and for the first time I allowed myself to feel proud without dimming that pride to make others comfortable, because no one here demanded I shrink, and that alone felt like freedom. As night came, I walked Orbit along the quiet street in front of my home, the porch lights of neighbors creating soft halos on the pavement, and I thought about Rick and Tyler, and how the last I heard they were still dealing with the consequences of their choices. And although a part of me wished they had learned something valuable from the fallout, another part of me accepted that their growth was no longer my responsibility, that my role was not to fix them or forgive them, but to release them so I could continue forward without carrying their chaos on my back. When I returned home and closed the door behind me, I felt the full weight of peace settle into the room, and I whispered to myself that certain chapters do not end because everything is resolved, but because you finally outgrow the space where the hurt once lived. Standing in the living room, looking at the framed diploma on the wall and the quiet glow of the lamps and the way Orbit curled on the rug, I realized that the life I was building no longer resembled survival, but something far richer, something shaped by clarity and agency and the refusal to return to environments that dim the spirit. And as I turned off the lights and headed toward my bedroom, I understood that freedom is not only the absence of harm, but the presence of choices made without fear. Some money builds safety, mine built freedom, and if you have ever rebuilt your life after a toxic family, I want you to tell me your city and your state, because I read everything.